Soundproof, which is on book production and what is involved in producing a printed book. And we'll be hearing about it from a publisher and a printer. And they'll get into a bit about pre-production, post-production, and also address some of the concerns of independent publishers. So I'd like to invite Amit Chauhan and Sudhanva Deshpande onto the stage, please. Amit is Head Content Solutions and Strategic International Business at Repro India Limited. His expertise is in business development, sales, account management, print and digital publishing processes, digital content management and distribution, and e-commerce. His role at Repro requires him to acquire content from new and existing content providers, especially from the publishing industry. Sudhanva Deshpande is Managing Editor at Leftward Books, New Delhi, and an actor and director with Jananatya Manch. He is involved in the running of Studio Saptar and the adjacent Mayday bookstore. He is currently writing a book on the life and the death of Saptar Hashmi. Welcome you both, and over to you.
Thanks very much. Very pleased to be here, and thanks for inviting us for this panel, Leo. And congratulations to everyone in your team who's made this amazing conference possible. I know there's a lot of hard work that goes into it, and a lot of commitment and passion and love and so on. And we are feeling that love. So thank you very much. So just a quick sort of background before I start, which is that for the longest time my friends in publishing would say, "Arey, Sudhanva, he is an actor and a theatre person who occasionally publishes books when he gets bored," and which was, kind of true, because I spent a lot of time doing theatre, and that in some ways is my first passion, I have to confess. So in some ways I've been in publishing accidentally. I landed in it completely accidentally. I didn't know that I wanted to be a publisher. And not to bore you with my life story, but just to say that as a result, I've always tried to find shortcuts. And so some of what you hear today from me is going to be from that experience of having been in publishing for now a pretty long time, but never having thought of myself primarily as a publisher. I think of myself primarily as an actor and an activist. So, I try to kind of find my way around and so on. So the other thing, of course, is that I worked at Tulika for a few years, where I learned the basics of editing, but I didn't have anything to do with production at that stage. And then when Leftward Books started, I got drafted there, and I had no idea how to produce a book. I didn't even know what the real stages of, the various things that happen. This was back in the winter of 98, 99. This was before we got a lot of the tools and technology that we use today. So, one just tried to kind of make things up, try to figure out, speak to friends, and so on. So, the other thing, of course, is that working in Leftward Books, we are a very small company, and it's a very small operation. We never have a lot of cash, neither in the books nor in hand. Okay? So as a result, one is always trying to find simple ways of doing things and trying to find sort of, so it's not like one has learned this stuff anywhere. I've not been trained anywhere. I've never attended a publishing course and so on. Whatever I've picked up by doing, and whatever I've picked up by encountering real problems, to which every time one had to find a solution based on that problem, and then one tried to think back and say, okay, this might be something I need to keep in mind for the future, and so on. So, just to say that, of course, pre-production, as you know, has essentially three main parts, right? First, you have to acquire a manuscript or the idea of a manuscript, right? You may not even get the book, but you think of the idea, you talk to a prospective author or editor and so on. So acquiring is one part of it. Once you get the text, then you have to edit it, and then you have to prepare it for printing, to send it to the printer. And so I'm going to take you up to that point, after which I'll be handing over to Amit, and he'll be addressing the printing part of it, the actual production of the physical production of the book is what he'll be handling. As we all know, this is a simple thing. We are all in some ways connected to publishing. Publishing is of course not one thing. There's all kinds of publishing. And one of the things that I still am kind of intrigued by is, why is trade publishing called trade publishing? Surely all kinds of publishing is for trade, no? We are selling we are selling books, right? It is for trade. But anyway, for whatever reason, historical reason, legacy reason, that the term is stuck. We all kind of have a sense of what that means and so on. But there are different types of publishing, and so therefore the production process that is involved in them is also somewhat different according to what kind of publishing you do. So therefore, for instance, if you're doing, let's say, large format coffee table or art books or something, then it's fairly different from what you might do for, let's say, the kind of publishing I do mainly, which is, I don't even know what it is. It's a kind of a niche publishing. It's a left-wing press. We don't do too many picture books. We've done one large illustrated book, which won the prize, by the way, at PubNext a couple of years ago. I have a copy here to show off. So apart from that, we haven't really done that kind of stuff, but I will be talking about that to give you a sense of what kind of thinking went into producing a book that had to be light and so on and so forth. So I'll come to that. But depending on what kind of publishing you do, there would be certain aspects that you would need to keep in mind for the production part of it. So if you're doing children's books, illustrated, full color, etc., all of that has its own thing. Now, I'm obviously not competent to speak about all of these, right? I'm not even sure I'm competent to speak about what I am speaking about, but whatever. But depending on what your area is, you'll have to figure out your own ways, and of course seek help and so on from others. Acquiring a manuscript is also not one thing, right? It is about trying to add to your list. You have a sense of what your list is. You have a sense of what your prospective audience might be. You may not have only one type of list. You may have multiple types of list. You may be running different imprints under the large umbrella. You might be publishing in several languages, or 2 or 3 languages, whatever it is. So therefore, you are thinking about each of these, in a sense, as silos, and trying to add to your list and trying to maximize what you get out of your list. But also, you would be looking at connections across the lists, at some points at least. You would be scouting for new voices, and of course, you would be also trying to persuade established authors, because we all know that established authors who already have a following amongst readers help you to sell those books that they publish with you, but they also carry with them other books that you publish. So you're able to reach newer readerships and so on, that help you to then carry other books to this new readership. Also, it gives you a certain prestige that a well-known author is publishing with you. It gives you visibility and so on and so forth. Now, yesterday, of course, we had the masterclass on editing, and editing itself, I'm not going to go into details of this, but really editing itself is not, again, one thing, right? It's many different levels at which you operate, and it may not even be the case that it's the same person who does all these things, but in smaller publishing houses, in independent publishing houses, which can't afford to keep a large staff and so on, it might well be the case that the same person ends up doing all of these things. So the same person who is going to be scouting for books, soliciting manuscripts and so on, might be the same person who does the final proofreading before it goes to press. Yeah, and so that does mean that the person will have to wear different hats at different points of time. I generally don't do any proofing and so on. I don't even pay much attention to things like punctuation and stuff when I'm reading the manuscript for the first time. Right? I'm really looking at the logic of the argument, I'm looking at how it is structured and so on. And once I've read it through, then I might go to the second level, which is to think about each chapter or each section, whatever it is, think about which paragraphs come first, how is the argument being opened, what's the context that's being set, how does it unfold and so on. And then one might get to the level at which one starts working on each sentence. And saying, okay, do I need this sentence, do I need this word, do I need this punctuation here, etc., etc. And then of course there's the technical part, which is to say, things like, for instance, making sure that all the footnotes are in standard format, whatever your house style may be and so on. It does help to have a house style, but honestly, through all these years, 20 years of Leftword, we still don't have a house style. Because one of the things that we've discovered is that because we are who we are a small publishing house, and we are often working with authors who are at two ends of the spectrum. Either one is working with authors who are fairly well established, so they have their own style of writing, footnoting and so on and so forth, or we have authors who are really new and who are struggling to even just write their first book. So in both these cases, at least our experience is that it's not very wise to impose a house style on them, not to tell them in advance that this is how you want it. Sometimes authors are very careful and they'll sort of make sure that their own referencing, their own standardizations, etc., are in place, fairly well done, in which case then you don't want to tamper too much with it, and you don't want to change all of that and impose your own house style on it. As long as it's internally consistent, it's fine. On the other hand, there would be other authors who would have it all over the place, in which case you do want to standardize the whole thing and so on. With some of the young authors that we work with who are not even necessarily very proficient with English, so then if you impose this on them initially and say, no, this is the house style, etc., they get even more intimidated. So what you want to tell them is, it doesn't matter, just write. Whatever your ideas are, you have great ideas, you've done this research, whatever it is, write. And then we'll work on it. And there's a lot of work that we do with the authors in figuring out both what their style is going to be, trying to help them find their voice, but also just the house style, standardizations and so on. Now, I mentioned all of these, although it's part of the editing process, because all of these have implications for later. For when you start thinking about turning a set of words into a book, right? Because when the first email comes to you with the first draft of the manuscript, it's just words, right? But all of this will have an impact on the actual production process as well. Now, of course, everything is on the internet these days, and it's great to have the internet. It's great to check spellings. It's great to check usages, it's great to check synonyms and so on and so forth, but also, honestly, it is great to also have actual books on your table that you can refer to. These are some of the books that I find very useful, but this is obviously a very personal list, and it's not even a complete list. It's just an indicative list. There would be other books that you would find useful to refer to. All I'm saying is that it's damn useful to refer to books. Don't just depend on the internet. As Ritu said yesterday, like Wikipedia may not be the best reference in all cases. So, just it helps to be careful with these things. When we are preparing the book for actual, so when the first edit happens, that's when I also start thinking about what format this book is going to go into. Generally, we have a fairly standard format for our books, for Leftword books, but it's not necessary. And I've just brought 3-4 samples to show you just to say that, these can be different types of, so sometimes, like for instance, we brought out this book, which is the translation of the Communist Manifesto in Hindi. And we've called this series the Little Red Books. And the idea is that there should be little, and of course they're red books, they're, whatever. And they're also red books in the sense that these books have been read by a large number of people, right, historically. And when we were working on this book, the translation is fantastic. By Subhashini Adi, it's a really super translation of the manifesto. Those of us who have read the manifesto in Hindi translation earlier would remember the very trite translation that had come to us from the Soviet Union. Of course, it was translated in India, but through the ages of the Soviet Union, it was kind of trite, it was dry, boring. And so we said to Subhashini, why don't you do a translation again? And she did a superb translation. It's really readable, poetic, does justice to the original. And when we were laying out the book, I said to Nazif, my colleague who's sitting here, and to Shipra, who's the Hindi editor, sitting right there, I said, how cool would it be if we do this as a bilingual edition? Because the translation is so good. Let people see it in context of the English. And of course we can't do the German. But how about we do that? So then it became okay, so we wanted, these are little red books, so at that time we didn't know what the size of the book was going to be. So finally we decided on this almost square format, and it's bilingual, so we have hardly any margins here, right? Because it's a small book, it's the kind of book that we want young people to carry in their pocket, literally, and to be able to read on a bus, in a metro, or whatever it is, right? And so as you start thinking about the nature of the book, what kind of book is it, how is it going to be used by readers, that's when you also start thinking about, at least I start thinking about the format, physically how is it going to look, and so on. This is the standard size in which we produce books, 5.5, 8.5, demi, and so on. But sometimes we also do larger books like the Bhagat Singh jail notebook. Now this has a yellow cover because we were trying to save money on this. And we said, okay, how about we just use like yellow paper and do a single color, non-laminated sort of cover, because the idea is that it's rough. It's a jail notebook, he's writing it in jail and so on. So therefore, and then we went to the market and saw what were the colors available. Yellow was the one that seemed okay to us. We've also done this in red and in white, I think. So it just, whatever is available, one tends to use that. But having a larger format was useful because one needed to have footnotes, one needed to be able to have margins and so on for this book. But we've also done some other stuff slightly smaller. This of course is a little bit of waste of paper because the edges do get cut off, but it's still okay. And then if you're doing a book like this, which is a thin book but which has photographs in it in color, then you need to think about that process as well. And there's this, Rehearsing Freedom, which is this big book for which we won the award. Now this was a very special book for us. It's something that we don't normally do. It's a book with lots of images and some text. I'll leave it here for you to look at later if you are so interested. But one of the challenges in this book was that this is a book on the Freedom Theatre in Palestine, and the Freedom Theatre has Friends of Freedom Theatre associations in different parts of the world. There's one in the US, there's one in Sweden, one in Portugal, in France, and so on. And the Freedom Theatre said to us that, look, this book has to travel. So individual copies are going to be ordered by people in all these countries. So therefore we had to figure out a way of making it as light as possible. So therefore, not to have a hardback, although it's the size that would kind of demand a hardback, but not to have a hardback, not to have a dust jacket. And also within the inside the book you'll see at various points there are these inserts which are like half pages, or not exactly half pages, but you know, like part pages, right? And these are pages that only hold text. Of course, there's also text on the full pages, but these are specific kind of text that is going on to this. And one very important reason for doing something like this was again to make it light, because the paper that we are printing the rest of the book on has to be relatively thick, even though it's not art paper, but it still had to be relatively thick to take the heavy inking that we were going to be doing on the book. So therefore, our designer Sharna Dastoor, who's also worked a lot with Indu, for instance, she and I, we sat and we thought about this a lot, looked at various paper samples, this, that, all the rest of it, and so on. And we finally decided that look, these half pages would make sense, partly because they're offsetting the other kinds of text. So it's a different level of text that's going on to those half pages, but also it reduces the weight of the book overall. And so therefore it's really useful for us. Every gram that we save is useful in international shipping and things. So these are the kinds of decisions that one starts making as one is working on editing the book. So editing the book, for me at least, is not an isolated thing of just working on the text. And that's the larger point I'm trying to make. It's through the process of editing the book that I start thinking about what is going to be the physical format of this book. I also start thinking about what's going to be the cover design of the book, and so on. Many of our books are designed, the covers are designed by Sharna, but she is often quite busy and so on, and so if she doesn't have the time, I have to do it myself, which I do because we really don't have the money to hire designers and so on, and one kind of dabbles in all kinds of things. So that's the other thing. I mean, I made this point already, but to make it again, which is to say that in small publishers, in independent small publishing houses, editors often have to learn skills, and we all have to learn to do things that may not be our core competence. But I was lucky in the sense that my first job ever was a teaching job at the National Institute of Design, of all places, and I had no background in design. I knew nothing about design. But I landed up there and it was a teaching job. Of course, I wasn't teaching design, I was teaching other things. But because I was there and I was interacting with so many designers, and I got to see so much stuff, and I got access to their fantastic library, that's when a lot of stuff opened up to me. And even though I'm not a designer really, I think there was some orientation that I got at a very young age. I was not even 25 at that time. So I was actually the same age as some of the students there. And so I got an orientation towards design and to look at fonts and typography and stuff like that, completely by chance. At that time I didn't know that I was going to end up in publishing. I had no clue what was going to happen in my life. But I did end up in publishing, and I find that a lot of the stuff that I got at that point, and then subsequently sitting with Sharna, sitting with somebody like Arijit Sen from Goa. So these are all friends that one made through NID in a sense, and just sitting with them, etc., one has learned at least some basic stuff, so one can produce half decent covers. At least they are not embarrassingly bad in most cases. But one just finds that it's a useful skill to have also, because our turnaround time for books is often very quick. So from the time that we get the manuscript to the time that we actually produce the book, sometimes it's as little as 3 weeks. Simply because there is pressure, the author is not delivered on time, but there's some event that's going to happen at which the book has to launch, etc., whatever it is, right? And so one has to rush through things and so on. And there again, it helps that everything is centralized with us. It's all done in-house. It's only recently, over the last couple of years, that we've got so for about 16 years of Leftward, the first 16 years of Leftward's existence, I was the only editor, which meant that I was editor and whatever, designer and coffee maker and everything else. And then Vijay Prashad my colleague and friend and comrade, he came on board as chief editor. And then, so now it's Vijay and I, and two more editors, that is Nazif and Shipra. So now we actually have an editorial team, and now we can divide work amongst ourselves. But for the longest time, for 15 or 16 years, there was nothing like that. It was all one person doing most of it, except for cover design, where I would go to Sharna and she would help me. But I'm just trying to say that if you're setting up a publishing house, or if you're working in a small publishing house, it's really important for editors to learn the whole thing. Not just be focused on the words, because all of this is going to be part of what one ends up doing. And then of course there's the other stuff which is to do with copyright, permissions, etc., etc. We've just had a fantastic session on contracts and stuff, which is connected to copyright. But pricing again is connected to, of course, your cost of production and what you think, how much you think you're going to sell, and so on. So, of course, there's no magic wand. There's no simple. I mean, there might be an algorithm out there which I don't know of, but as far as I'm concerned, at Leftward we don't have an algorithm by which we know that this book is going to sell so many copies, so therefore we can price it at this level and so on. One kind of makes it up as one goes along, and one makes decisions based on experience, and more than that, one makes decisions based on a gut. So therefore, earlier this year we published a book by A.G. Noorani. It's a big fat 550 odd pages hardcover book called The RSS, A Menace to India. When that book came along, it took a long time in making the book because the writing process was long and protracted and so on. When the book came along, we had already spent a lot of money on the book, and so on. But also because I felt like this is a book that is going to sell. No matter what happens, this book is going to sell. And I also felt like if we don't make some money on this book, then where are we going to make our money on? We have to make money somewhere. And the money that we make on the RSS by Noorani Sahab is going to help us do X number of other things, right? So therefore, going completely contrary to what our comrades felt and so on, we got some flack for this. I priced a 550-page hardcover at 1500 rupees, and we said we'll see what happens. It's okay. And of course, we sold out the first edition super fast. We did a second hardcover. We sold that out as well, and now the first paperback edition is out, and that's priced at a much more reasonable 695. But we also we also have a book club scheme, because we sell online and offline through our store. So we have a book club scheme, and book club members get a discount. So they get 30-35%, whatever it is. For this book we gave a slightly larger discount when the hardcover came out, and so on. So all I'm trying to say is that even as far as the pricing and so on is concerned, all of that one does keeping in mind both that particular book and what its potential might be, but also keeping in mind the overall structure of what you're doing. So there are other books that we underprice a little bit from what it should be, because we feel that these are books that activists are more likely to buy, these are books that students are more likely to buy, and so on. And then on top of that, we give discounts to our book club members, and we ship the book at a very low shipping price and so on. So overall, it kind of makes sense. But honestly speaking, we are not very business oriented. I'm not saying this as a badge of honor. I wish I was more business oriented. I wish I had more of a head for figures. I sadly don't have it. But one tries to make things happen. One tries to sort of juggle things a little bit and make sure that every year we do at least one or two books that will earn us some decent money that helps us to do a whole lot of the other stuff that we really want to do. there's a range of softwares that you will need to be friends with. There's Word, of course, because Word is now the default word processing program that's used almost all over the world now. All your authors are going to send in their manuscripts in MS Word. So therefore you need to know what Word can do and also what it can't do or what it does very badly. Now typically the final layout of your book, in most cases I'm guessing, at least for us it's true, we do it in InDesign. We used to use PageMaker earlier, but PageMaker was a really clunky and a really awful software, and then finally Adobe decided to junk it and come up with something entirely new that's based on, that's kind of, so if you know PageMaker, then InDesign is really easy to learn, right? And so therefore I found that I made the transition quite easily, quite seamlessly. I didn't even realize, I thought that I would struggle with it a little bit more, I didn't. The first book that I did on InDesign, it just felt like I was at home with it. Photoshop, of course, you need to know at least the basics of Photoshop, because again, if you don't have access to designers and so on and so forth, you're going to get images either for the cover or for the inside text pages, and you will need to work on them. So at least the basics of Photoshop is something that you would need to know. For covers, you know, we do it on InDesign now, but earlier we used to do it on CorelDRAW. But I know that people do it also on Photoshop, on Illustrator and so on. So at least some basic working knowledge of all of these softwares is useful, especially if you're going to be working with a designer who may be using one of these softwares. And of course PDF is useful because PDF is something that you send your final files out in, right? So the files that go for output finally to the printer go out in PDF, but also PDFs are useful because you often want to share the PDF with the author finally, and not, I mean, even before the final stage, at the semi-final stage, let's say, when it's like 85-90% done, even at that stage sometimes you want to share the PDF and not the Word file, because authors can make changes to the Word file and you don't realize what the changes they've made, and not everybody is very meticulous with noting every change that they make and so on. So you don't want the authors to mess up something that you worked so hard at, and they're not doing it out of sort of, you know, malice. It's just that they're not trained to do this, and you should not expect them to, it's unfair to expect them to be so diligent and careful at that stage, right? Because authors are also excited, their book is going to come out, they see it in almost final shape and so on. So it's, I find that at that stage it's in fact much better to share a PDF with authors and say, you please give your comments. There's a way in which on PDF you can give comments, or you can write your comments in a Word file and send it back, whatever changes have to be made. Or if they want to rewrite something, then extract that as a Word file separately and send only that, so that you can slot that in later. Now, Word, of course, is kind of good. It's useful. I find some parts of Word quite useful. I find other parts very clunky, so I don't tend to use them. You know, the most typical things that we all use is find and replace and so on. But again, you have to be careful about every time you hit change all, right? Because you don't want these kind of things to happen, right? Macros, I don't know how many of you use macros. How many of you work with Word? Are there people who work with Word? Do you use macros? Macros, you use macros? No.
I hate working with Word.
Yeah, I know. You do?
It's the most awful software.
Okay. So macros are actually damn good. And it takes a little bit of time to just learn it, but Nazif here has figured it out and he does it brilliantly. So, sorry? So macros is basically, what it does is, if there are repeated tasks that you have to perform and you need to isolate those, then you can do it through macros. So basically it's a don't get intimidated by this, but basically what you're doing is you're writing a little bit of code, except you're not writing the code, right? The program is writing the code, so you don't have to know any any code writing, basically it runs that code on your file, and it's able to identify whatever it is that you need it to identify. So what we use it for instance, is to make sure that all our standard spelling standardizations of proper nouns, names, places and so on, to isolate that from the rest of the text and to just make sure that everything is okay. This is the spelling I've used at this point, this is the spelling I've used at that point, which is the standardized spelling, what am I going to do, right? So it's damn useful because you can do a find and replace, but it's hard to, in books that have a lot of names and places and all of that, it's hard to sometimes even remember what all is there. It's hard when you're editing to keep track of every word that you want to check up on later. You can miss things. Macros are fantastic for identifying something across the whole document without you having to exercise any brains or to remember anything. And once that is isolated, then you standardize it and then you slot it back in. That's basically the thing, alright? I like to use comments because sometimes, especially when the three of us are working together on a manuscript. So Vijay has done one round of editing, then it might come to me, I might do a round of reading, I may not do an actual edit, and then it will go to Nazif and so on. So I might just put in comments rather than make an edit, because eventually it's going to be for Nazif to go through the whole thing, or the other way around, whatever it is. Sometimes I find comments useful for authors as well. So when I'm sending back comments to authors and stuff. Track changes I hate, honestly. I just cannot stand them. I can't make sense of a page if there's even one track change stuff there, but some people seem to like it, so good luck. InDesign is a really cool program, and InDesign has a ton of stuff that you can use. Most of us don't end up using even 5% of what InDesign does, including myself. But InDesign can do a ton of stuff. Some of these things most of you who do use InDesign would know. Probably you know all of these. So stop me if I'm saying the obvious things. But these are some of the things that I find really cool, and some not so cool. Styles. Of course, there are paragraph styles and character styles. Both are very, very useful tools. They save a lot of time for you. You don't have to keep, every paragraph, etc. doesn't have to be formatted separately. Greps are again things that we discovered fairly recently. So we've started using it for the last 6 months or so. Greps again are commands that you can give. So for instance, you can create a command that says any paragraph that ends in a line with fewer than 10 characters should not be. So in other words, the entire paragraph will get formatted like that. That you'll never have a paragraph that ends with a line with just it full stop. That's the it'll never do that. The program itself already sort of does the design work for you in one sense. You can also program it to make sure that you don't ever have widows and orphans and stuff like that. You can also identify all the words that have, let's say, all caps, or all the words that have full, like capital letters followed by full stops. Initials of names, but also sometimes you don't want to identify initials of names. Sometimes you want to identify organizations because the author has written, and stuff like that. So you can fine tune it quite a lot. You can do it, of course, for initials of names, but you can also say only in cases where it's more than 2 capital letters and full. If there's a third one or more, identify only those, right? And so on. So it's pretty cool, and it saves a lot of time, and it basically makes sure that there's no human error that creeps in, because the software is doing the work for you, and it really works nicely. Tables, I hate tables in InDesign. Maybe there's some magic way in which people do tables in InDesign. I have never found a way of dealing with tables that is really nice, attractive, and so on. So I end up doing it manually, but again, you know, it's possible that there's a way of doing it, I just don't know about it. Hyphenation, I don't typically use automatic hyphenation because you can run into real trouble with that. This is a real case that has happened to me once, and the author was furious because it was a book on nuclear policy and so on. You know, so you don't want these kind of accidents to happen, right? So I just switch off automatic hyphenation. I only do manual hyphenation. But in Word, in InDesign, there's a really cool thing called discretionary hyphens. I don't know how many of you use those, but discretionary hyphens are basically as follows: that you put a hyphen to break a word, right? And then it breaks and goes over to the next line, but then something else has happened in that paragraph, and you lost track and you worked whatever, and then you made a change in the first line, for instance. So now the whole line is shifted, and the hyphen is shifted with it. Now the line doesn't break with the hyphen, right? So it's not the last thing on the line, it's in the middle of the line, right? The discretionary hyphen automatically disappears when that happens. It's a really cool thing. So always, whenever you're inserting hyphens in InDesign, only use discretionary hyphens. They're really cool. They just disappear. It's fantastic. There's more. In InDesign, I don't know how many of you know, but you can you have a standard space, right? But you can also have different types of spaces that you can insert. So you can have hairline space. You can have a sixth of the space. You can have thin space, quarter space, third. You can have the end dash space. You can have end dash space. It's not a dash. It's a space of that width, of the end width and the M width, etc. And these are particularly useful when you're working on covers, because sometimes on covers you want them to be a little bit more, you know, or on headers and so on, that type of stuff. Or sometimes when you have names like VKRB Rao, right, or something, you know, then you might want to separate them a little bit. Or if you have double quotes followed by single quotes immediately, right? So you may want a thin space in between, otherwise it looks like three quotes, right? So for those sorts of things, some of these spaces are damn useful. Indexing again is something that PageMaker did not do very well, but InDesign does really well. It's damn useful. Please use it if you can. It's not very hard to learn, and you will find that a lot of your work happens already if you. It takes a little bit of trying and learning. It takes a little bit of trial and effort, but if you do it 2 or 3 times, you'll find that you'll figure out what kind of index you want, and therefore what kind of entries you want to make initially in your file. These are embedded entries in the text, right? And so the index that gets generated is a fairly final index. It's like 80-85% is done, often. I mean, it depends. I'm not giving it's not a, you know, always that will be the case. It depends on what kind of index you want and so on. But it's actually much better than what PageMaker used to do. In the old PageMaker days, what I used to do was to, once I had the final PageMaker file, I would copy paste each page, the text of each page, onto a Word file and give page breaks. You know, so I would create a separate Word file after everything was done that would mimic the page breaks of the PageMaker file, and then generate an index on Word, because Word was still better than PageMaker. But of course, any index that you generate through a computer, you will still have to exercise your own brains, and you'll have to work on that index. It's not like it's one magic wand and it all gets done, because ultimately, as we know, computers are what they are. InDesign also has a very nice feature called package. So you can package your final output, in which case it also extracts fonts, and it gives you the links to images. And all of that is put in a folder with instructions that you can just send off to your printer if you want. If the printer wants to have an open file instead of a closed file. But I found over the years that this is also damn useful. I used to do this manually earlier till InDesign made this possible automatically. Is that it's always useful to save those fonts separately, because fonts change, computers change, etc., etc. You lose fonts and so on, and then years later when you have to reprint that book, that even the PDF might not have been generated at a time when embedding fonts was easy, or whatever it is. For all kinds of reasons, you might find that fonts, you don't anymore have access to those fonts, and so therefore your files may not open correctly. So even for legacy issues, it's damn useful to have a package so that you know all your images are in one place, all your fonts are in one place, everything is there, you don't have to worry about it later. And again, InDesign does this quite automatically. And then of course there's the PDF presets, that it depends on what kind of output you want. Do you want an output to only share with the author, in which case you'll do the smallest file size. If you want to send it for output, for press, whatever it is. So there are presets that you have, and you can tweak those presets and so on. But InDesign is quite smart with all of that. So I actually have taken to InDesign quite a lot. I love working on InDesign. I also tend to do the cover designs on InDesign, which I earlier used to work on CorelDRAW most of the time. Again, these are things that nobody taught me. Right. So typically, and Purvasha knows this. So every time she says to me, Sudhu, what does this mean? Something in a software, etc. I say, who do you have to ask? You have to ask Google auntie. Right? What does this mean? Or how do I do this? And it's astonishing. It really is. I mean, any time that I've asked Google this question, how do I? And then follow it up even with a complicated query, right? Typically you will find the answer. Typically you will find the answer, because X number of other people in the world have also asked Google the same question, right? So that's when really the power of this metadata, you see it in action, and it's damn useful. So I just find that Google is damn useful for training yourself in the software that you're working with. And keep asking, does this software do this or not? Don't assume that it doesn't do it, because I swear to you, I found that almost 80% of any software that's on our computers, we don't use. There are so many features there that we don't use, and you just discover, oh my God, you can also do this. Arey, isme to ye bhi hota hai, isme to ye bhi hota hai. It's quite amazing. And of course hota hai, because that's why they have been made, right? And there's a sort of cumulative knowledge of, in a sense, humankind that's embedded in these softwares. So they're very powerful tools, and you should check them. The other thing that I use a lot is a website called InDesign Secrets. They have a newsletter. You can subscribe to it. It's damn good, because they always give you tips. They give you ways of figuring things out and so on. And some of these things that I've told you about just now are things that I learned from InDesign Secrets, because they said, oh, did you know that InDesign also does this? And you say, oh wow, oh okay, I didn't know it did that, right? And it's really cool. But of course there are like a ton of other resources. I'm just telling you what I use. The other thing that I've also found is that YouTube, of course, is fun to watch for whatever stand-up comedy or whatever it is that you watch. But YouTube also has a ton of videos that show you how to do things. I'm a cyclist. I do all my repairs by myself, and every repair that I've learned how to do on my cycle, I've learned through YouTube videos. Similarly, everything, or not everything, but many of the things that I've learned about InDesign and Word and Photoshop and so on, there are YouTube tutorials that just tell you how to do it step by step. They spell it out, they break it up, and it's damn useful. So, if you need to, if you need to, say, have a word in which you need the outline to be in a certain whatever, shaded something and then insert a photograph in the middle of it, or 2 photos, 10 photos, whatever it is that you need to do, ask YouTube. In all probability, 99% there's going to be a video that will explain to you what it is and how to crack it. And then of course you fool around. Every time you get bored, you start nodding off, etc. Just randomly click things on InDesign, Photoshop, whatever it is, and just start playing around with what. Sometimes you screw up, but it's okay. You can always undo, you can, and so on. So I do that a lot, and I'm a big believer in just figuring things out by fooling around with the software, because that's what they're really meant for. And of course one asks friends and colleagues. That's it. I'm through with my part.
That's an instruction for me. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, Queenie. This is my first time at the Publishing Next. I was not sure how do we present over here. Is it very formal? Is it very informal? And I took guidance, and here am I. I also didn't want to start with slides because it is going to be, I want it to be an interactive session. Please ask questions when you see something that you don't understand, or see something that you understand and are not happy with or comfortable with. The first slide is something that I took over from Sudhanva, that he has now made the manuscript. And the 3 guys, the 3 friends are author, editor and the publisher. They are all wanting the book to be converted to a format that we are expecting the book to be like that.
Which one is which?
I would leave that to all of you to name. So,
Who's the guy with the tie in the tie?
I think that should be the publisher.
No, that's the printer for sure. No publisher.
No, the
or
printer is
just-
not there.
Oh,
The print, they are all, 3 of them are looking at the printer. Now how the work is with you. So, we are going to talk about the journey from here to here. Before going there, talking about printing or producing the book, we should understand how the retail landscape has changed over the last few years. All the logos that you are seeing over here are some sites that are a part of our everyday life. We go to Amazon for anything that we want. A basic structure is happening that if at all I want something, I look at Amazon at first. And books are also moving over there. We have been hearing about it since last 2 days, how the structures are changing. And it is not India, but the entire global industry has been affected by this. Now, nothing to worry about. After all, everything is a sale for a publisher. Everything is going to make money. What we should know is that how do we reach those other avenues which are emerging. And we should make our files, our book in such a way that we would be able to cater to all the sources that emerge hereafter. So nothing is going to comprehend or nothing is going to eat into any other source. It's increase of market is what I feel. Just to address a point of this discussion we had early in the morning, where Alvin said that 60% of the sales have transferred to online. So that was a bit of incomplete statement. Nothing towards Alvin, but this is only for the trade publishing. The academic publishing is yet very much offline, because academic publishing is driven by prescription and not choice. And it is a compulsory sale that has to happen on an academic publishing. So the sales are still very, very in the brick and mortar or the traditional sources that are happening. The trade publishing is moved over there only for the reason that the content consumption habits of the people have changed. I'm sitting at the airport and I look at a book at the store. I want it now. If I get it, I buy it. I don't look at the price at that point in time. And the same goes for the ebook. If I want to read a book now, I get the book now. So these things are changing, and we are going to just have a look at them back of our mind so that we are aware of what things happen. Also, one more important thing. Now, this is a study by Nielsen. But the book sells less than the cost of a coffee. So very, very important point. So the decisions that we make while producing a book, we have to keep in mind that our book is going to be sold for less than a coffee. Sorry?
How much does a latte cost? It depends where you buy it.
Exactly. So a latte usually you would buy at a Starbucks or a cafe coffee day at most. That's why I said latte, not a coffee. So that calls in for the decision that I have to make, where do I print? I have three choices. I can go as offset print, I can do a print on demand, or I can do a PDF or an ebook to be distributed only through the channels as a publisher. The three choices are determined by my history and my ability to sell as a publisher. If I have a forecasted readership already, offset is the best way so that I can bring down my production cost. I have higher volumes, but I also have the capacity and the supply chain to make sure that I complete all the stock that I have produced. Or I have an established readership because of an author that I have signed, and the author has his own following. If I don't have either of that ready with me, or I'm not too sure of any of those, then POD might be a good option to start with, where you can actually experience new authors, have author advance copies, have try out new segments, give trials to your distributors, get orders from the distributors first, and then produce a larger run. So you get multiple options over there, and the entire mid and back list can go on POD at any given point of time. And the last one is the PDF and EPUB, and then you have multiple avenues, Kindle and any other players that you should put your books on. Now all of these three require the file to be made in the correct form. When you make the file, you also have to look at, again, the methodology. Like I said, offset as well as print on demand. So traditionally, Repro has been an offset printer for last 30 years. We have been printing and producing almost 1 million books per day, and we are Asia's largest exporter of printed books through our offset mechanism. We have started into POD from 2009, and from that, these 10 years, we have pretty much grown on the POD segment as well. We work both of these segments in collaboration with each other rather than competing onto each other. The only difference is the mechanism offset, that you get a book printed, have it pushed into a box, get it on a truck, get it to a distribution warehouse, get it out of the box, onto your inventory, smaller boxes, truck, retail, out of the box, shelf, and wait for a customer to buy. So that's a huge chain. And then you are investing upfront. You are printing the book first and then selling the book. POD works exactly opposite. You can actually sell a book first and then produce it. So how it happens is that the e-retail website could be an online channel, could be a publisher's own website. Collect the orders over there. The files are already set up with your print-on-demand printer. You produce over there. Either it goes to publisher warehouse, it can be dispatched directly to the customer, or it can go to the e-retail warehouse from where the order is generated. So you cut out all the unnecessary supply chain in the middle so that you make most money over there. In the first instance, you have used logistics at least thrice. In the second instance, it's only once. But that's a tremendous cost saving overall, if at all you look at. So the mechanism is sell first and print later. Three important point which Sudhan also mentioned in his presentation while preparing the file is font, images, and understanding your layout of the book. By fonts, I mean usually, I'm not too sure with anybody here has ever bought a font. Fantastic. Well, because fonts are IPRs. You need to fonts are IPRs. We need to buy fonts ideally, and there are font repositories that you can subscribe to getting into that. However, on a generic term, whatever system fonts are available on your Windows or Mac machine, you usually compose your book into those fonts. And those fonts cannot always get exported as a converted or embedded font while you prepare a final PDF file. You have to ensure that happens. Word doesn't always support that. So while you make a file in the Word, you have to be very, very careful about fonts. The second thing is that Word you usually design on an A4 layout, and your book is going to be a 6:9 or a 5.5 by 8.5. Those two things don't work together. The third thing is that your computer has a X resolution, the resolution of the pre-press will be a Y resolution, and then the layout of the text differs completely. So there are few things that you should be looking at. Images, make sure that all the images are at least 300 dpi. 72 dpi images are the images generally downloaded from the internet. You don't come to know because those images look good on screen, but they don't translate good on paper at all. And the third and the last column that I have mentioned over there, the blue line is the line or the area that you should be placing your entire work within. The area after that is a margin, the area after that is a bleed, and then there is a final trim line. So you have to be very sure where your matter ends on the particular book, and only the part that needs to be bled has to pass on to the bleed area. And those are the three things, if at all we look at, I think we are very good to go on the file. There is an asterisk on the last column where I have said that know your crop marks. I mean that you should not print your crop marks on the PDF file while sending to the printer, because those are generated at the pre-press level. Those should not be appearing on the file as such, otherwise those would be printed on the book. So you have just to know it. Those are silent marks. This is the biggest decision or the biggest choice that every publisher has to make. Paper, it's 55 to 60% of the value of your cost of the book. Now, the paper is determined by the genre of the book of publishing you are doing. If you are a trade publisher, generally yellow paper or a natural shade is what is used. The other advantage of natural shade is that it can be of higher bulk, so you have a bigger spine, but a lesser weight. So it is very easy to transport it logically. It saves a lot of cost over there. For academic publishers, because the paper cannot be of a higher bulk, it has to absorb all the ink and the colors. It has to be white with a small bulk but a high grammage. So it is very, very heavy in the weight. So even a 500-page book of Pearson and a 500-page book of a Penguin would weigh drastically different. So you have to keep in mind the choices of your paper. The best way to talk about the paper is to understand and talk to your printer that you have decided to work with. The printer will have certain paper in stock, and you might look at building your strategy around the stock, because just in case your book does well and you need some copies after that, you have a continuity into the paper. Otherwise, sourcing paper is very, very difficult. And with the way that globally the paper industry is moving, it is going to be much more difficult altogether.
Sorry, Amit, should we be
Yeah,
interrupting you, or-
please, that's fine. You
I
can
can
ask.
ask the question
Yes,
at the end if
yes.
you want. No,
I'm
just to-
comfortable.
Just to ask, are there restrictions on the kind of paper that you use between POD and offset?
And if yes, if you could just explain the highest grammage you can go to for POD printing, for academic book printing, white paper, and also paper sizes, which affects the format of the book.
So almost all trim sizes are covered on the POD as well as offset. Usually 8 by 11 is something that people generally have the highest on the academic side. It can go maximum up to 8.5 by 11 or 11.25 inches.
Inches close size.
Yes, the final trim.
And the paper grammage?
Paper could be 75, it could be 78, it could
Not
be
80.
68.
Not 80.
78 and 80 is same. So we
More or
do
less.
78 because it generally translates to 80. There is a variance of 2% in every mill.
Okay, I'll ask you this question later then.
Then you have to make a choice of the binding. Book should be perfect bound or a hard bound, because that also is going to determine your final cost to the market. And there are multiple ways that you decide. In fact, Sudhanva covered this into this selection process. If at all you have already decided it, that's perfectly fine. But when you are working with a particular printer, you have to address and understand whether the printer is capable to produce a hardback and a paperback and a combination of both, and stop one and start another at a seamless level or not. Lastly, but very importantly, is the metadata. The book is going to be displayed something like this on an online channel. It has to display all the information it has about it on the channel, because every single word mentioned over here translates into a keyword for someone who is finding about that particular book. And then the book has to be discoverable immediately after one is searching. So the metadata is very, very important. So all of these four aspects do go well while we produce. The second importance of this metadata is coming from the way that the books are produced on POD. So going back to the couple of slides when I said that POD is sell first and print later, that translates over here. So now this book, if at all you see, I'm sure you would not be able to see, but trust me on my words, there's a buy box on the right hand side. If you are able to see the big box with two yellow buttons over there. In that buy box it is written, if you order the book now, you will get the book delivered in so and so hours, which means that the book is available on Amazon to be ordered now. Now this particular book is not in stock on Amazon. It will be produced once the order is received. So once the order is received, this book will be pushing the order into our systems. Our systems would call in for that content. The content would fall onto a printing machine. It would fall, that book block would fall on a black and white machine. The cover would fall on a different color machine. They would be printed on two different sequences. They would be merged together on the binder. If the barcodes match, the book would be bound. Otherwise, it would be thrown off the belt. Once it is trimmed, it would be dispatched. And once it is dispatched, Amazon would give instruction to the end user that your book is ready and it is being dispatched. You can expect the book in the next 8 hours or 18 hours depending on the distance you are. Now why I'm telling you this is that the metadata over here is very, very important for us to produce the book. This entire process happens completely automated. There is no manual intervention. We don't know which book is going to be ordered at what point of the day, and we are working 24/7. So all the books fall by the content request it makes, not only the ISBN, but the exact trim specs, the specifications of the particular book, and then the overall process is taken care of. So because of this, on POD, there is a standardization of paper. So you need to select on the set of the papers which are available, should your book be sold on a one book sale model, so that you don't have to have any warehousing for that, but you still make a sale. But should you be using POD for stocking, that you want 50 copies of a book, then you have a choice of paper, because it is not going to be done completely automated. So this is something that I want to make a mention about. POD is not about printing. Not at all. You should not equate POD and offset together, compare costs. POD is about availability. POD is about publishing. POD is about at all times, at all places, any given moment, content is required, it is delivered. So we should just look at POD as a mode of making books available and not losing sales. So simply, this is something that a publisher should look at. If at all, any of the points that I have mentioned over here makes any sense for any publisher, then POD should be considered by the publisher. Because this actually takes a lot of pressure off the publisher's shoulder and head in terms of thinking of the things which can be managed by us in a much better way, because that is revenue center for us and we look at our revenues very seriously. All of these things are cost centers for the publishers, and you generally tend to cut the corners to save the costs. You should not be looking at that. Both the entities together would be focusing on individual revenue centers, and we have a fantastic liaison in place. So no upfront investment for title setup, forecasting not required, no inventory care, no obsolescence, no warehousing costs, no freight cost, and no loss in sales.
No freight costs?
So no, because we are a prime seller, when the book is sold online, the deliveries to the customer are free deliveries.
But if we place an order for...
So we can include that as a part. So now we have a couple of plants in India that saves the freight a lot of time, because you don't need to bring from Mumbai to Delhi. Simply speaking is that global distribution of entire catalog is quite possible for all the publishers through POD. You don't need to look at where do you want to go, where do you want to tie up with, how do you do the IPR management, how do you ensure that only 1,000 copies of a particular book are sold when you ask to be sold not more than that. All of these things get managed by technology. We have reached to more than 30,000 channels. So the morning Naveen also mentioned the same thing. So the same 30,000 channels that they also distribute through us. And it makes distribution quite easy for the publishers. So now open to questions.
What is the average price difference between POD and offset?
So again, it's a very difficult question to answer very simply, but I'll just try to make an attempt to do that. It really works very well, and it is very, very cheap than to photocopy a book. So we make sure that the POD costs are not prohibitive so that a piracy can happen. So it is fairly business wise, and you can make profits, you can have a strategy around it, and you can use offset plus POD as a hybrid model of a particular book.
Okay,
What are these 30,000 channels you speak
So
of?
these 30,000 channels are a mix of online channels, international libraries, UK, US, Australia, Europe, all the countries put together, countries with POD establishments in China, Russia, Korea, the better part of the Korea of course, Poland, and all the other Amazon stores, that is the 13 Amazon stores all covered put together.
If you had to just reduce that to the domestic distribution channels?
So domestic online distribution channels, there are about 5 in India which are currently operational, which are selling books. On all of these 5 channels, we list as virtual inventory. We do not print a single book. We do not send a book into Amazon warehouses. I don't have to wait for Amazon appointments. The moment the book is on my catalog, it is prime on Amazon. Once the book is prime against a normal book, it has 3x visibility. Means that there are 3 times people are going to see it more. There are chances that people would be ordering the book more than they would order a non-prime book. So put yourselves into buyer's shoes and see what type of stuff you would buy. Would you buy a prime or a non-prime seller? That gives you that. The second thing is that the messaging is something that we control because we have a commitment to the channels, Amazon, Flipkart, in terms of deliveries to them. So the SLA that we have with both of them is about 4 hours from the time of the order receipt. So for example, at 10 a.m. I receive an order for a book, 2 p.m. or latest 3 p.m. Amazon picks it up from my warehouse to be delivered to the customer. With Mumbai and Delhi both plants put together, we would be able to cover 75 to 80% of pin codes of the country with a 4-hour commitment to Amazon, which translates to a 24-hour free delivery to almost 80% of the country.
What is the price difference?
please. You need a mic in your hand because we are recording. So I will participate.
Generally, what is the difference approximately for the print in offset and the print on demand, POD?
So cost. It depends on how many pages you are going to
For example,
produce.
200 pages book.
So the cost would be around 30-40% higher than offset. But the fact that I also want to make over here is that the selling price is going to be same. Now choose a scenario. You're producing a book on offset. You have 1,000 copies in your warehouse. You have put it into the Amazon warehouses, wherever it is. It is in Delhi, it is in Mumbai, but the order comes from somewhere in Kolkata, somewhere in Hyderabad. Those won't see it as a one-day delivery. That the sale would not happen. That glance would not convert to a sale. Had the title be on POD, it would have converted because it's Amazon's guarantee of fulfillment of that title through us. That's what makes the difference. So you don't lose a sale. Anytime a publisher who has ever sold a single book on Amazon will have a history of lost sales. Once you get that report from Amazon, you can look how much sales you have already lost.
But also, Amit, just to clarify, when you make this percentage offset versus POD, you're not accounting for you're only accounting for printing
Yeah.
cost,
Yeah.
but you're not accounting for the saving on the warehousing and
Exactly.
all of that.
So that's why I said that POD is not about printing. I wanted to emphasize on that. It is not a print alternative. It is a sale alternative. Would you want to sell your book or not? That's that alternative. POD is a means to do that.
My question is to Sudhanva. Sudhanva, you mentioned the software used. Would it not make immense sense to use free software alternatives? And I don't mean free as in cheap or low cost. I mean free as in freedom. Ideologically, it is the left alternative for you also. And you know the tools are there, whether it is Lix, whether it is Cape, whether it is GIMP. They are amazing quality tools. We are using, difficult to learn, no doubt, very easy to use. And it has not only cost implications, but it has technological implications, particularly for a country like India at the stage we are. I get calls from Coral who tells me that we have found traces of Coral in your system. We are coming for an audit. So I listen to them for 5 seconds and then I give them a lecture for 15 minutes. Because I told them, even if you give me Coral for free, I'm not going to use it. You know, they are just trying to sell you the one license copy. That's all that they want to do. No audit or anything like that. So there are political, technological and quality implications in this debate. I am urging people like you especially to have a deeper look at it.
Well, I mean, honestly, it's like this. There are so many battles you can fight, and there are battles that you choose to fight, and there are other battles that you don't choose. You choose not to fight, at least at the moment. We have to deal with a number of people. We have to deal with authors, we have to deal with designers, we have to deal with our own internal systems. I work in a situation where my colleague, that's Vijay, he's based in the US and he travels a lot. So at any given point of time, he might be in God knows where. So the systems that one is relying on, the actual computers that one is relying on, are all over the place and they use all kinds of systems. Several years ago, I mean, I could try it again, sure, but several years ago I did make the change to Linux. My entire system in the office, all the computers we changed to Linux, and then I installed all the free software, etc., etc. The learning curve is so steep, or was at least at that point. It may have changed by now, that's possible. But the learning curve and just getting everything in sync was so complicated for me. And it was just I was like a single person working in an office where I had to generate the books on time every time, because otherwise how do I pay the bills? And it just became very, very difficult. Honestly, that's the honest answer. I would love to. Ideologically, I'm totally for it, 100%. I would love to shift to free software, to Linux and all the other things that will go with it. It's just not been possible for me. I have friends who do it, but then there are researchers who are working singly, basically. They don't have to liaise with a whole range of other people. Right? I have to send files to my printer. I have to sometimes send open files to my printer. You know, and I can't afford a situation where anything goes wrong at that point. I just cannot afford it. So either I convert my printer to free software, which then
Means all the publishers convert to free software.
yeah, I mean, unless one reaches that point where the majority of publishers have converted to free software, it's very hard for an individual enterprise to do it.
Just
That's the honest answer.
1 minute
honestly.
response. This is like socialism in one country. Anyway, but
No, it's not. It's not. It's
I
not
was just
socialism.
joking. I was just joking. I agree with you fully. Learning curve is steep. You need support for it. It's not a one-man job. You need support. But on the other hand, as far as importing from any other system goes, it's entirely flawless. It can import Word. It can take in any document. It can send to your printers, not open files. Like high-quality PDF. And open files are risky in any case. I don't know how many open files.
Not very good for
You adjust margins and also.
No, it's not just printers. It's not just printers. We work with a whole lot of other people. So like my designer, for instance, I'll have to convert my designer's way of working in systems to open software. I cannot do that. How can I tell her, you must change your system? I am now working with a young designer sitting in Calcutta who have just started working with. You know, how can I tell her, no, you don't use Photoshop, or you don't use. InDesign or Illustrator and so on. It's very hard. It's honestly very hard. I mean, I'm just saying. If we were a large corporation where everything happens in-house, sure we could make the change. I guess, I don't know. I've never worked in a very large corporation, so I can't speak for them. But I'm just saying, honestly, honest to goodness, this is the answer. I would love to. I hate working on pirated software because that's what I use. I have not bought any software in my life.
Want the auditors to come to Shadi Kanpur like they are to?
I mean,
Well, it's about 80% of us who are on the pirated software.
yeah, everybody knows. No, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, I take your point. I'm just saying, I'm just communicating to you what my difficulty has been. It's not like we didn't make the effort. We did make the effort, and for 6 months we were jacked.
I agree. Okay, next question, sir.
Yeah, the question is to you. As you say, there is metadata for each and every book that you have to create so that it is visible online everywhere. So what are the things that come in under metadata? Can you just expand on that?
So metadata starts with the name of the book, the ISBN for all the editions. The hardcover, paperback, ebook should have different ISBN. It should be collaborated that all the 3 ISBNs refer to a single source of content. It should tell what the publisher was, original date of publishing, if at all any rights have been transferred in the line of the book till date so far, any restrictions of geography that the book will have on selling, details about the author's social media, the thumbnails of the book, that is the book cover, the spine of the book, the number of pages that the book contains, the trim of the book, so that the freight cost of the journals is determined by the trim size and the page count, so that they have an algorithm to calculate the weight that it would cost, it would generate for it to be shipped across the location. So these are few. That's a 282 column sheet that you should actually fill, but nobody does that. International publishers are doing it right now, but at least you should reach to a position where at least first 30-40 basic necessity, if at all you are able to fill, it serves 80% of the purpose. And metadata continues to grow because every time a title is being redesigned, got a new life, something more has been written about that particular title again. So you can add to the metadata. You have 2 descriptions, short description, long description. So your description displays on the channel. If at all any instructions are there that you have to mention that in India only paperback edition is available, you can mention it in your description. If at all you have got any scanned images, you can make a disclaimer that the book contains scanned images which are taken from an open source, doesn't require any copyright violation laws to be looked at, and we do not intend any right on those particular. All of those things can be made available through the descriptions.
Amit, just 2 short questions. One is, I've understood the difference between, in paper choice and format, because we've been operating on the basis of one book.
Yeah.
What is that? One book, whatever. And so are you saying that if I need to print 50 copies of a certain book and stock it myself, which I'm ordering from Repro, I could get it in the original format without any trimming of the format, the size, and in the original paper.
So size won't matter. I can give the same size.
No, size has mattered for me in the past, but anyway.
Yeah. So now the technology has changed.
I can get 2 versions. The other more important question actually is, we get many prospective buyers who write to us asking if such and such book. For me, the basic attraction of POD is that none of my titles are out of print.
Correct.
Yeah. So if there is a query, and this is an instruction across the office, you will not send that stock email in reply to say, sorry, the book is out of stock. No book is out of stock.
Correct.
But over and beyond that, how do we communicate to that buyer where to go and find this book? You see, we've written to Repro asking them, so which ties up with the channels where the distribution happens from. So what do we tell the buyer who writes us a simple email, I want a copy of the book or I want 2 copies of this book, where do we go for it? And we tell them it's available with Repro.
Yeah.
But beyond that, we have to give them a website or an address, somewhere they can go to.
Sure. So I would be able to make the answer that you just give to your orderers and go to Repro. That would be made live in a couple of months because we are setting up a B2B website for the entire catalog and the signed publishers that we have. So anybody would be able to come over there and place their orders. Second thing is that you can collect the order. You can ask me to print that book on our agreed contracts. I will ship it to the person. You don't need to get involved over there. The third option is that if you don't want to do that, you can ask them to go on Amazon and buy the book. On Amazon, the only factor is that they won't be able to buy more than 2 copies at a time because we have restrictions, because in most of the cases piracy generates from such things, so we restrict the sale over there.
Any other questions? Mr. Lalapana.
Have Apana. All the printing related questions are answered. Yeah?
No, let us to do some questions.
Wait, Karthika wants to ask a question, then we can turn our...
It's not possible to do cover ops on digital, is it? I mean, like embossing and
No,
UV and so on?
on Book of One it's not possible. As a print order it's possible because we have time for that. On a Book of One, like I said, 4 hours, there is no way that...
But if it's like 100 copies, 200 copies, then
anything
you can
50
do
copies
it.
above, we can do that.
And then what happens to the cost?
So the
Is it-
cost is as actual because there is no scale to that.
Okay, so it's
So,
per book,
yeah,
whatever it costs
whatever
and
it
offset
costs,
it
yeah,
cost in
yeah.
this as well.
Yeah, but it's quite possible. And those are
Okay.
the replenishment copies is what say we can call that. You have
Yeah.
produced a long run and now you only need 60 copies of it. But there is a good way that we are handling this with the entire trade industry, all the large publishers including Penguin, Harper, Rupa, Jaico, that they run out of their first lot and then we generate a second line of business for them. In the description we say that these books are going to be produced on POD, it won't be with cover finishing, but it is available day one. So we make a very, very transparent statement on the channel and that's where Amazon has helped us in terms of flashing that upfront. So the buyer is completely aware that the book will not be with cover finishing. So that there are no returns on those books. So
Just
those
one-
are the things that they usually do to ensure that the sales are not lost. Because the front list titles, you put 10,000 copies into the market and before you know, they are all sold out. And then the next 5,000 lot to come, there is 15-day gap. The 15-day gap is from the publisher to the distributors and there is a 7-day gap from the distributor to Amazon warehouse. In those 21 days, you lose the sale. You don't lose the sale only, you lose the rank. You lose the in-stock percentage and Amazon lose the confidence that this book will be back again. So it's a huge loss, it goes into a spiral and that's where POD helps. It maintains the rank, it always sells when somebody looks at it. And you don't lose the rank of the book at all.
Hi Amit, question from Himanshu. I presume the POD orders that you're talking about are for books which are white paper and text.
Both white paper as well as natural shade.
Right. But how about POD for books which are, let's say, photograph heavy? Or is it there or is it not there?
It is there. So we call it as a premium color editions and those are produced on large, thicker paper like 110 GSM, 150, 170, 210 because all the covers are produced at a 250 GSM any which ways. There is a technology. It's that it is not so cost effective as of now. The changes are being expected. You can see some changes coming by the end of this calendar year.
Just 1 second, there's a question there. There's no mic there.
Actually, I am creating a book using InDesign. Textar I am using CMYK mode. And the pictures I am using RGB mode. That is fine?
No, not at all.
Why?
Not at all. So, what is the mode you are going to produce your book? Offset or POD? POD. You have to have a 300 dpi JPEG or a TIFF image, which is a CMYK background image. RGB image doesn't translate well on the machines. The second thing is that Your text should never be CMYK. It should be 100% black. You should not use any ICC profiles on your text at all, neither on images at all. Your images should always be linked to the file. It should not be directly pasted on the book. Once you paste the image on the book, it translates to a 72 dpi output or a maximum 96 dpi.
You had a question.
CMYK you're doing, whether you're doing offset or POD, either way you do CMYK.
Yeah, it's more
ebook that you do
RGB, yeah, because it's seen on screen, so the vibrancy is expected there.
One of the things that, I also wanted to kind of cover in this is that when you're preparing files, the final files for print, usually the output is also done for ebooks, right, with XML tagging. Is that something that you expect when publishers send you their PDFs?
So in case where we are making the files for the publisher, we do ask them whether they want an ebook or an EPUB, because EPUB is more worldly accepted format rather than just an ebook, which is a PDF or a print replica PDF, what people call. So for EPUB to be generated, it has to be then addressed on two levels, whether it has to be a fixed layout or a reflowable layout. Usually trade books can go into a reflowable layout because it could be read on any sort of devices. But children's book have to be fixed layout because the text, if at all is flowing around the image, it has to stay there. It cannot reflow. So those are the things which can be done, and in InDesign it's quite possible to do it while designing.
For a publisher like LeftPoint, how do you forecast how many copies you must make? Because how do you read your market?
Well, one part of it is how do you read the market, but the other, what's become more and more important, because now the turnaround time in printing and so on has gone down so much that we can actually reprint, even in offset, we can reprint something in a week's time. And for our kind of book, it's never going to be that kind of mardar nahi hota hai. It's not like a Harry Potter or something. So therefore, we always have that little bit of time in which we can turn things around. But for us, the more important issue is warehousing, because where do you keep books? And because we also run a bookstore, and the bookstore keeps books from all our allied independent publishers, and we keep at least one copy in stock all the time at the bookstore. So therefore, our warehousing is the most important thing. So we give print runs not based on expected sales, but we give print runs based on what is the space available. But there are some books that.
So true.
What?
That's so true, I said.
Yeah. But there are some books that you just know. You know that this is going to do well. Like I gave the example of Noorani's book. Now that one we did the first print, I think 750 copies. The second one we did 1000 copies. And we were absolutely sure as soon as we gave the first print order, we told the printer that look, in 2 or 3 weeks time we are going to come back again with another print run. And that was exactly how it happened. I think in 3 weeks time we had done the second print, hardcover, 1000 copies again. So even though it was so highly priced, etc., but because it's Noorani Sahab, because it's RSS, so one just knew that it would sell. But other books, like the rest of the books we typically do 750 copies, because we don't usually do hardcovers now. Most of our list we do in paperback, and you do 750 copies, it doesn't take too much space to store, you still have enough to give to distributors. And then for us to reprint is so easy. It also looks nice to say reprinted so many times, which is now a bit of a fraud, but it's just one of those things that you do just for the kick of it.
Why are you calling it a fraud? It's not a fraud.
It's a fraud in the sense that you could
750 copies, come on.
You could have reprinted 350
For academic
copies.
books, that's a very respectable number.
No, for academic, yes, but for my kind of books, sometimes I do even like 550 copies. Right, so every time we reprint something, we say reprint. Earlier it used to be 1100 copies and so on, in the old days it was kind of assumed that if you did a certain kind of book, 1100 copies you would print. Now that's no longer the case. You could actually print 250 copies and still call it one more print. But
taking off from what Sudhu is saying, this is a question to you, Amit. Since warehousing is the problem that constrains small and independent publishers, for sure, large publishers as well, which is why most publishers are going into e-formats or would you consider, stocking? Since you call yourself a distributor,
Yes.
yeah?
And
So, small runs,
yeah.
whatever, 50 to 100 or
Sure.
each book title that comes to you from a client base, if you both stocked and traded out, wouldn't that make the publisher improve her arrangement with you in terms of volume?
So in fact, that's what we do. Apart from Penguin and Harper, who have exclusive distributor engagement with all other publishers, we have this hybrid model. So for example, a publisher has produced certain copies on offset already. We take physical copies from the publisher as well for selling those online. Those copies now, we don't have to sell again to Amazon warehouses. We can sell from our own stocks. Those are still called as Prime. But we also do a program which is called we call it as a gap program, which means that your front list titles, if at all they go out of stock, we produce them on print on demand and still make the sale. The moment you replenish us with physical stock again, my POD stops. And then we continue to do that till the title is transferred into 100% mid list. Then it is only POD. So the publisher is only focusing on the front list, which is 5 to 7% of the catalog. They can concentrate very well on that list, produce high quality books on offset, and make sure if at all they have a forecast of 50,000 copies to be sold, just print 25,000 copies, and rest everything can be replenished through POD. If at all I do a 50 unit sale of that particular book in a month, we do a 600 run immediately. So that's how it translates very well for the publisher. That's why I said it's a hybrid work and it cannot classify as offset versus POD. It is going to be a single line of supply chain solution that we usually call it.
So you would have to be the offset printer?
Not required, not necessary. We would like to, but it's not necessary. So there are publishers who are based out of Delhi. They usually print in Delhi, ship it to us. Now that we are in Delhi, they also ship it to us in Delhi. So again, the freight is saved over there. The moment they go out of stock of our warehouse and the sale occurs, we produce on POD. But we also have the file set up from day one. And this works very well for the academic as well, especially the test prep market. And we cover the entire test prep publishers of the country. So for example, a test is going to be scheduled in September. The book is released 3 months earlier, somewhere around June, July, or end of May. Same day when the file is ready, I list the book and the sales start to trickle down. The moment the book is printed by the publisher, going into distributor, going into Amazon, it falls 50% discount. At that time, I stop selling POD. I let the book go out of stock and then sell POD again. So the publisher continuously makes money at a differential price point.
And these decisions are yours.
So it's ours. And that's why I say that we work with publishers on a contractual basis. One-off relationship, we're not able to justify at all. So if someone just gives us a quote, we would definitely not qualify the job. But if at all someone works with us, the scale that we operate on, we are India's highest consumer of paper, apart from the newspaper guys. So we do about 90,000 tons a year. That's the translation that we offer to the publishers. That's a contract, even if there are fluctuations, everything is taken care of.
We have a question here.
Yeah, hi. My question is to Amit. Two questions. One, do you take up any export orders? One. Second, do you have any, in some way, is either an independent storefront or like a Shopify or Sellify? Anything can be connected to your production line through any API or something? Or you're open only for the Amazon, the likes of Amazon?
So I'll answer both the questions. We do export. We have a large publisher set for whom we print in India and ship it out of India. Like I mentioned in my introduction, we have been India's largest exporter of printed books for the past 7 years. So we ship out
You take up the POD export?
POD, it is not required to export. That's why we have a POD distribution engagement what you're seeing over it.
Some places if it makes economic sense.
Yeah, it's possible. So we have the licenses to do, we have the capability capabilities to do, we have the infrastructure to do it. But we do have better ways to reach out in days rather than weeks. Because you have to ship, then you have to ship actually sailing. Otherwise you don't have the scale of economy. The second question is that, yes, we are building tech on our own. We would be coming up with our own APIs and storefronts. We do have for our certain contracted publishers right now also. We are expanding it to a larger scale.
Any other question? Or should we end for the day?
Okay, that is a good idea. It gives us 15 minutes more of, I don't know what, relaxation, swimming time and other things. Last session our energies are slightly low, so I keep forgetting. Thank you so much. It was such a informative session for us. So wish you all a good evening, and I hope we'll see everybody here at the dinner later tonight at Simon.